Humankind is at a crossroad. We are facing an unprecedented crime against humanity and are confronted with the task of defending human dignity and human rights. The situation that we face concerns the forced organ harvesting of living people perpetrated by the Chinese government for more than 2 decades. It is a crime that is beyond imagination and too gruesome to accept. I would like to welcome our honored speakers and our audience watching the live stream broadcast via the NDTV and Epoch Times TV platforms. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we start, let us recall the historic roots for today's gathering, the signing of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Palais de Chaillot has a unique history. The initial building, the Palais de Trocadéro, was built in the late 19th century before it was rebuilt for the Exposition Internationale in 1937 under the name it is known today, the Palais de Chaillot. It sits majestically across the Eiffel Tower. Few people would have imagined that at that time, just a decade later, it would become the venue of adopting one of the most important international documents in world history, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was in 1948, here in this building, in the center of Paris in France, that this document, as well as the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, were signed at the 6th General Assembly of the United Nations. It is in this very building, the Palace of Chaillot, that this crowning event sealed the mandate of the United Nations to safeguard and protect all people, all nations, all religions and all beliefs, regardless of gender or political beliefs. Today, hundreds of thousands of tourists come to Paris to visit this historic site to take a prime view of the Eiffel Tower, probably not knowing that it is the signing of the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights that gives them the freedom to visit Paris and take this spectacular view. In 1985, in remembrance of the early beginnings of the United Nations, the French President François Mitterrand renamed the square between the palaces the Parvis de Liberté et de Droits de l'Homme, the Square of Liberties and Human Rights. In the center of the square is a commemorative plaque that thousands of people have walked across without realizing that it is a reminder of the human rights we enjoy today. But from a different perspective, it might also be an analogy of the actual state of human rights today. Taking the basic rights for granted, we are lacking appropriate respect and trample on it without realizing that we need to revive those basic human rights every day, or otherwise it is just a distant memory of some historic event. Today, on the 10th of December, we take this opportunity to remember and to revive what has been signed in this historic site 73 years ago. Back in 1948, nobody would have asked why the international community was singling out Nazi Germany. It was obvious. Nazi Germany had just carried out the most horrifying genocide of the 20th century. The primary victim of the Holocaust were the Jewish people, and one simply cannot speak about the Holocaust without speaking about the Jewish people. For the past 2 decades, we have witnessed an unprecedented crime of state-sanctioned forced organ harvesting from living Falun Gong practitioners in China. And just as the Holocaust is inseparably linked to the Jewish people, forced organ harvesting in China is inseparably linked to the 70 million Falun Gong practitioners who have been subjected to cold genocide over the past 2 decades. We need to ask ourselves if we still appreciate and celebrate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And do we apply universal human rights to all groups and people with the same intention as in 1948? In the case of China, we have to ask whether there is a 2-tiered standard for human rights. one for Nazi Germany and another for the People's Republic of China. Many governments have been submissive to China due to economic concerns. This is similar to the period prior to the rise of the Nazi regime in the 1930s. Many governments have accepted China's crimes and turned a blind eye to its grave human rights abuses. Whether willful or naive, these governments have fallen prey to the blunt deception of human rights with Chinese characteristics. The Chinese Communist Party leadership despises human rights and mocks the Western world for clinging to it. Before we begin to hear from our speakers, I have an update. Professor Michael Mockery, who dearly wished to attend, sadly will not be joining us today due to scheduling conflict. Professor Mockery is outraged by the criminal acts perpetrated by medical professionals in China. As head of a department of neurosurgery in Austria, he strongly believes in the respect and defense of medical ethics. Professor Mockery sent us a short statement that I will read for you. As a medical doctor who practiced medicine for 40 years and as the director of a university hospital for 13 years, the idea of organ harvesting without the prior consent of the donor is ethically, religiously, and morally deeply repugnant to me. Organizations that take such measures, as well as their henchmen, that means the persons who are involved in the removal as well as the implantation of illegally obtained organs, are criminal and cannot be justified by anything. Thank you, Dr. Mockery, for your support and defense of medical ethics. Let us now hear from our distinguished speakers. Mr. Garnet Jenas, a member of the Canadian Parliament, has continued the tradition of Canadian parliamentarians to speak in support of human rights and to defend Falun Gong practitioners through his commitment in supporting human rights. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Garnet Jenas.
Hello there. My name is Garnet Jenas. I'm a member of Parliament from Canada, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. This is International Human Rights Day. I've always cared deeply about human rights, and in some sense, by necessity. This is my family background. You see, my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. She was living in Germany during the Second World War, and she would explain to us the factors that allowed her to survive. She was hiding out on farms, sheltered by sympathetic people in the part of Germany she was in. And she attributed, in large part, her survival to the willingness of someone named Clemens von Galen. There's a portrait of Clemens von Galen on the wall behind me. Von Galen was a vocal critic of the Nazis. He was someone who was willing to speak out at great risk to himself and those around him to oppose the evil that was taking place. It was important for him, a person of power and privilege in terms of his position and his background, to speak out in a way that provided support and, in a sense, protection to someone like my grandmother, who lacked power and privilege in the society that she was. And it is thanks to people like von Galen, who were willing to speak out about human rights at the time, that people like my grandmother were able to survive. So now I think of my role as a member of Parliament being in many ways like that position of von Galen, that is, being in a position of being able to speak out for justice, human rights, human dignity, and give voice to the desires, the aspirations of those who face injustice and yet are not in a position to be able to speak for themselves. And I see many parallels between the human rights abuses of the past, some of the things that my grandmother experienced, and some of the human rights abuses that we see going on today. And when I think about the victims of modern day human rights abuses, I think about the promise we made to my grandmother's generation, a promise of never again. Never again will we allow the kind of horrific abuses that her and others experienced to be repeated. And yet we have failed to deliver on that promise. So we need to step up. We need to work to do more to defend human rights in the present context in response to the escalating horrific abuses of human rights that we see in certain countries around the world. And today, I want to speak primarily about a particular piece of legislation that I brought to the House of Commons, Bill S-204 from the last Parliament in Canada, a bill that I brought in the spring of this year in a previous parliamentary session after it had received unanimous support in Canada's Senate. The bill was initially proposed in the Canadian Senate by my excellent colleague, Senator Salma Atulajan. Bill S-204 seeks to fight against organ harvesting and trafficking by reducing demand. And in the process, it would save lives. If this bill is passed, it would make it a criminal offense for a person to go abroad to procure an organ taken without consent. It also creates provisions by which a person could be deemed inadmissible to Canada if they are involved in forced organ harvesting and trafficking. Now, before Bill S-204, there was a similar bill we tried in a previous Parliament, Bill S-240, and before that, Bill C-350. This was a reintroduced version of a private member's bill that had been proposed in 2013, and then before that in 2008 by other MPs. In every case, the mechanism has been the same. That is to try to fight organ harvesting and trafficking by criminalizing the act of going abroad to receive an organ taken without consent. Prosecution for extraterritorial action is a little bit easier in this case than in some other cases, because transplant patients require follow-up when they return to Canada or return to whatever their country of origin is. It is easier to identify cases where people have received an organ and be able to use that as a basis for asking further questions. So I've mentioned some of this legislative history in Canada. The fact is we've talked about forced organ harvesting in the Canadian Parliament for well over a decade. And in the course of that time, parliamentarians from every party have agreed that we have to do something about this. This is an urgent matter of human rights, that we have to act to respond. We've tabled many petitions targeting forced organ harvesting. We've worked across party lines at every opportunity we've had. There's been calls for investigation into this horrific practice. Strong statements have been issued to condemn the actions of the Chinese Communist Party and to call for the Canadian government to intervene and take active measures to stop the practice that is obviously so repugnant to a just and free society. This issue has been raised again and again in the House of Commons and committees and by civil society. And yet we still have had trouble getting the consensus required to fast-track the bill and thus run out of time in every case. I'm hopeful that this Parliament will be the one to finally pass an organ harvesting and trafficking bill. As Albert Einstein said, the world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it. Indeed, the world is becoming increasingly dangerous for vulnerable minority groups like Falun Gong practitioners, Tibetans, Uyghur Muslims, Christians, and other prisoners of conscience in China. People who have committed no crime and are being abducted from their families, murdered by the state so that their organs can be sold and used for transplantation and for other purposes. Not only is forced organ harvesting in China an inhuman practice that violates the universal dignity inherent to all human beings, it systematically perpetuates this unthinkable crime against peaceful religious believers, human rights advocates, and ethnic minorities. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes the inherent dignity of all human beings. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. No one shall be subject to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Everyone must have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, freedom of opinion and expression. This cannot be compromised or forgotten. It is when we forget that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we now once again bear witness to acts that resemble barbarous, violent actions of the past that outraged the conscience of humanity, in particular in my grandmother's time. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights was adopted in response to the atrocities of the Second World War, when the international community, as I said, came together to say never again, to make that commitment to each other and to make that promise to young people and to subsequent generations. We have an opportunity, in fact, a responsibility to intervene while we still can, to do what we can to make good on that promise. And that's why countries around the world have passed legislation and resolutions to stand against the horrendous practice of forced organ harvesting. I want Canada and I want other countries to join Italy, Taiwan, Israel, and others who have led the way in enacting strong measures to end human trafficking and organ transplants, to criminalize the act for their citizens of going abroad to receive an organ taken without consent. This practice violates the right to life, liberty, and security of the person through subjecting prisoners of conscience who are denied the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, as well as the freedom of opinion and expression, to torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and punishment. Bill S-204, if passed, will serve to protect the rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for people persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party through the horrific practice of organ harvesting. It's a practical piece of legislation with practical measures. This bill will disincentivize any Canadian who is in need of organ to receive an organ that was forcibly taken without consent by criminalizing that action. And it will empower law enforcement to actively pursue those perpetuating this injustice and hold accountable those complicit in these evil acts. It is crucial that we, as people with the freedom to speak out and the capacity to respond to this most grievous violation of fundamental human rights, do our part in combating and preventing these human rights abuses. We as an international community, we have a responsibility to one another to uphold the principles and values which we have committed to, the principles and values which unite our human family. To stand by idly when innocent people are arbitrarily detained, tortured, and killed for their organs on an industrial scale, that reduces the human person as merely a means to an end and ignores their inherent worth and value. It fails to see and acknowledge the dignity and worth of the victims and their families in favor of the cruel slaughter being perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party. U.S. President Harry Truman said at the signing of the United Nations Charter, "We must build a new world, a far better one in which the eternal dignity of man is respected." 76 years later, we are still grappling with how we can uphold that basic fundamental human right of every person in this world, including and especially the victims of forced organ harvesting. It is also important to discuss the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting. It is a jointly launched initiative by stakeholders and NGOs from around the world, chief among them Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting from the United States, CAP Freedom of Conscience from Europe, Transplant Tourism Research Association from Japan, Korea Association for Ethical Organ Transplants from South Korea, and Taiwan Association for International Care of Organ Transplants from Taiwan. It was launched during this year's United Nations General Assembly in September during the event World Summit on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting. This declaration is an international roadmap to the steps that countries around the world, including Canada, can take to stand up and protect the fundamental rights of all victims of forced organ harvesting and trafficking. Bill S-204 will allow Canada to support this roadmap put in place by the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting. It will allow us to do our part in the fight against violating basic human rights by providing for the criminalization of inhuman acts and facilitating the criminal prosecution of forced organ harvesting at the national and international level. It would establish a criminal offense under Canadian law when committed intentionally the removal of human organs involuntarily from living or deceased donors where the removal is performed without the free, informed, and specific consent of the victims. This bill will allow Canada to take the necessary legislative measures to ensure effective criminal investigation and prosecution of offences that will take place in order to combat and prevent forced organ harvesting. It would also bar entry to any person known to be directly or indirectly participating in forced organ harvesting. And I want to just end with a quote from Elie Wiesel, another Holocaust survivor and a human rights activist, who said, "We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant." End of quote. So now is the time for us to take some and to do our part in combating and preventing the Chinese Communist Party's ongoing perpetration of this atrocious crime against its own population. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jennes, for speaking out against the different human rights violations committed by the Chinese Communist Party throughout the world, including the detention of lawyers and journalists in mainland China and Hong Kong, China's aggression in the South China Sea and against Taiwan, and the implications of the Belt and Road Initiative. Indeed, some people describe the Chinese government as a human rights bully and a provocateur of international rights. Congress Scott Penry is a member of the US Congress since 2013, and he strongly believes that there should be consequences to the untold number of Falun Gong practitioners who have died from forced organ harvesting, and is proposing a new bill to protect Falun Gong practitioners. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Representative Scott Penry.
Hi, I'm Congressman Scott Penry. I'm honored to join with Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, or DAFOH, at this global webinar to commemorate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Over the last several months, I've been privileged to work with DAFOH and others to advance legislation regarding the persecution of the Falun Gong in China. One of these bills is the Falun Gong Protection Act, which I will be introducing in the next few days. Our nation continues to witness increasingly distressing examples of Communist China's depravity and see clearly that it's directed a campaign to harvest the organs of Falun Gong practitioners. These are living people having their organs taken from them. Some 1.5 million believers may have lost their lives as the results. Advocates in America have repeatedly demonstrated our solidarity with the victims and will continue to do so. In June of 2016, the United States House of Representatives unanimously passed a resolution urging the international community to assist in ending China's genocidal forced organ harvesting program. This Congress, I introduced H.R. 5431, designated the Chinese Communist Party as a transnational criminal organization. In the bill, I cite the findings of the China Tribunal, which concluded that the crimes against the Falun Gong could constitute one of the world's worst atrocities committed in modern times. We need a targeted piece of legislation to specifically address the persecution of the Falun Gong in China, and that's why the introduction of the Falun Gong Protection Act couldn't be more timely. This bill would authorize President Biden to sanction anyone that has directly or indirectly contributed to forced organ harvesting within China. It would also instruct the Secretary of State to determine whether China's persecution of the Falun Gong constitutes an atrocity under a 2018 human rights bill. The definition of an atrocity includes both crimes against humanity as well as genocide, and encourages the State Department to formally decide the nature of the persecution of the Falun Gong, something that has been sorely missing in our China policy. This bill also reinforces basic principles of internationally recognized human rights, that every single person has the right to life, liberty, and the security of person. It also states that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. China's persecution of the Falun Gong, whether by forced organ harvesting or unjust imprisonment or forced labor, is evil and perverse. And the Congress must commit to ensuring that millions of Falun Gong practitioners are not denied the freedom to exercise their religious beliefs. The Falun Gong Protection Act goes a long way to placing pressure on the Chinese to abandon its cruel, regressive extermination agenda, which is exactly what it is. We must challenge the evil designs of the Chinese Communist Party, which entails highlighting its wanton disregard for basic standards of human decency. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to speak with you today about the Falun Gong Protection Act, and I look forward to working with each of you to move it through Congress. And at this time, I wish you God's blessings and good luck.
Thank you, Representative Penry, for your firm support of human rights through your work in the US Congress. It requires courage and determination. Your bills will make a difference in the lives of many people. Madame Annick Pontier is a member of the Belgian Parliament. On learning about the fate of Falun Gong practitioners and the horrors of forced organ harvesting, she immediately felt the need to react and bring these crimes against humanity to the forefront of Belgian politics. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Madame Annick Pontier.
Good afternoon to you all. I first of all would like to thank you for inviting me on this World Summit on combating and preventing forced organ harvesting. It is an honor for me to be one of the panel speakers today. As a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the Belgian Parliament, my focus lies on human rights in general and more specifically on the political situation in Asia. China, Taiwan, Hong Kong are my main fields of interests. I will speak to you about forced organ harvesting today from a political and ideological perspective as a member of the Belgian National Parliament. Thus far, forced organ harvesting hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the Belgian press and subsequently from politics. That is until recently, when ratification of the Treaty Against Trading in Human Organs from the Council of Europe was on the table in our Committee on Foreign Affairs. In my opinion, however, forced organ harvesting should get a lot more of attention from both the media and policymakers, because it constitutes an unmistakable crime against humanity. In my understanding, forced organ harvesting on living people has two main motivations. One is commercial, as we can see with gangs who earn a living by organ trade in Latin America, for example. The other is political and ideological. And however cruel and wrong commercial organ trading may be, it is the second motivation that frightens us the most and on which I will focus today. The main perpetrator today when it comes to politically driven organ harvesting is without any doubt China. Beijing persecutes different groups on ideological and political grounds because their affiliation does not match the totalitarian communist state ideology that Xi Jinping wants to impose upon all citizens. The organ harvesting of Chinese minority groups also has a commercial side, of course, because the organs get sold on the market. But most importantly, they are victimized because the government sees them as a threat to their ideology. Groups like the Uyghurs from Xinjiang, a Turkish ethnic minority, and most of all the spiritual movement of Falun Gong practitioners are today's victims of state-organized organ harvesting in China. This organ harvesting is part of a broader persecution system that the Chinese government uses to erase the religious, cultural and philosophical identities of these different groups. Some would go as far as calling the Chinese persecution programs in which they use forced organ harvesting genocidal. Now, the methods the Chinese government has deployed to eradicate groups like the Falun Gong practitioners and Uyghurs indeed have all the characteristics of a genocide. We as a political group have focused particularly on Falun Gong because they are in numbers the biggest victims today of forced organ harvesting in China. In their case, China has set up an entire bureaucracy with a centralized chain of command structure from the local policy level up to the central government in Beijing. They operate with the sole purpose of erasing Falun Gong and its practitioners. The practitioners get locked up, are being brainwashed, psychologically and physically tortured, executed, and their organs get forcefully harvested. Media propaganda also plays an important role in the Chinese persecution program by turning public opinion against Falun Gong with false information about their practices and philosophy. How is this possible? How can a country in today's developed world that accepted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights act so cruelly? The answer is quite simple. Chinese decision makers have a different conception of human rights than we do in the West. More so, they do not care about human rights at all and have no regard for human life if those lives don't further their internal communist agenda and their ambitions to become a global superpower. This way, a stance against China becomes a stance for human rights around the world. Because China doesn't mean to limit itself to what happens inside its own borders, it wants to exert influence all around the world and advance their totalitarian model. Now I will place the topic of forced organ harvesting into a Belgian political context. In Belgium, this phenomenon has received too little attention, like I said earlier. You could ask 100 different people about forced organ harvesting in China, and it's likely none of them have ever read or heard about it. I personally got acquainted with the problem by viewing the ruling of the China Tribunal in the spring of 2020 through a letter of the organization End Transplant Abuse in China. This ruling brought evidence of forced organ harvesting to light. I then started doing my own research and came into contact with representatives of Falun Gong, Falun Dafa in Belgium. They offered me a lot of insightful information about these shocking events surrounding organ harvesting in China. Later, I was present as a spectator and a guest at the World Summit in September 21 and the conference in October 21, and the various speeches from different perspectives further sharpened my knowledge about this topic. When I gathered enough information, I immediately started to take action in our parliament to put the persecution and forced organ harvesting against Falun Gong on the political agenda. This took on many forms. I did oral and written questions about the topic and the measures our government was taking on the subject. I wrote interpellations and gave recommendations about it to the government. I gave a public presentation of our views on China and the minority situation there. I highlighted the position of our own Belgian government on these matters with regards to the EU investment agreement that is being negotiated and the Belgian-Chinese extradition treaty. And we wrote, eventually, our own resolution. The last resolution adopted by the European Parliament dates back to 2013 and really had too little effect in practice. Our resolution has the intent of strongly condemning the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners and formulates a number of recommendations to the Belgian government. The text focuses on the case of Falun Gong as the biggest victim group of forced organ harvesting and persecution in China, but not exclusively. It is a broad resolution and it targets the repression of all prisoners of conscience by Beijing. The specific recommendations we make are diplomatic condemnation of these crimes against humanity in the Belgian international relations, and we also ask harsh actions against the Chinese regime, because talk is cheap, of course. We demand from the Belgian government to take a whole different approach regarding China and rethink our bilateral relations. In order not to become accomplices in the big crimes they commit, we must end investment agreements that only make Beijing rich and cost us a lot of money. Those one-sided agreements have always led to broken Chinese promises about equal playing fields and liberating their markets in the past, while they fully penetrate our European economy with unfair trading tactics. Our European money flows to Chinese state-controlled companies and nothing comes back. And of course that money is recouped by the government that uses it for their policies and military-industrial complex to domestically suppress minority groups and exert dominance outside their borders. My political party doesn't want any part of this and that is why we demand the Belgian government to put an end to the negotiations around the Belgian-Chinese investment agreement. We also demand from our government that they suspend the recently ratified extradition treaty with China. This treaty has been heavily criticized by human rights groups, and rightfully so. Beijing uses these types of extradition treaties to continue silencing and controlling opposition groups in other countries, because they fear being delivered to China, where they risk persecution or worse. The extradition treaty between Belgium and China forms a danger for persecuted minorities, like Falun Gong practitioners, dissident activists, Uyghurs, etc. China can easily claim someone to be a criminal, and Belgium has no means to verify that information. Belgium claims they have protection measures for persecuted groups in the treaty, but there is no way for our government to verify due process and human rights in China. In the Chinese operation Fox Hunt, extradition of persecuted groups already happened in different countries. We will also propose a hearing with experts on the subject in our Committee of Foreign Affairs when our resolution will be handled. Recently, there was also a resolution exclusively focusing on the protection of the Uyghurs in China that passed through our parliament by the ruling majority. We tried broadening the resolution towards all persecuted minority groups in China, also including Falun Gong, but this proposal or this amendment got voted away by the majority parties. That is why we want, with our own resolution, to be the first political group putting the persecution of Falun Gong on the agenda.
Thank you, Madame Pontier, for reminding us of the Chinese government's lack of respect of international treaties, even those that it has signed and ratified, like its abuse of extradition treaties to hunt down human rights victims that have escaped China. Indeed, the Chinese government does not allow other countries to check the legal proceedings of their claims, just as it does not allow the verification of the alleged written consent of Chinese organ donors. Lord Hunt of King's Heath from the United Kingdom is a staunch defender of ethical public health care and has worked non-stop to ensure that the British medical community and that British patients are protected from being implicated in forced organ harvesting by obtaining organs and tissues from vulnerable, non-consenting victims in China. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Lord Hunt.
Hello. On the 10th of December 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris. The first time, it set out fundamental human rights to be universally protected. Notably, this happened after the devastation of the Second World War and Hitler's murderous regime, when the international community vowed never to allow atrocities like those of that conflict to happen again. As we commemorate the 10th of December, 70 years on, severe human rights abuses are still happening in our world. Arguably, the worst of those abuses is still taking place in China today. My interest in tackling the issue of forced organ harvesting in China came about after I was a sponsor of the Opt-out Organ Donation Act, which is now in UK legislation. I took the view that in our opt-out system, if we are asked the public to have full confidence in it, it was essential that its ethical basis was assured and overseen with rigorous inspection and regulation. When I first heard about forced organ harvesting in China, forcibly extracting organs from prisoners of conscience, I was horrified. Organ donation is a precious act of saving a life, but forced organ harvesting is commercialized murder, without doubt among the worst of crimes. Article 3, subsection 2 of the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting states the killing of vulnerable prisoners for the purpose of harvesting and selling their organs for transplant is an egregious and intolerable violation of the fundamental right to life. My Organ Tourism and Cadavers on Display Bill, which had its second reading on the 16th of July this year in the House of Lords, serves to prevent UK citizens from complicity in forced organ harvesting by amending the Human Tissue Act to ensure that UK citizens cannot travel to countries such as China for organ transplantation, and to put a stop to the dreadful travelling circus of body exhibitions which sources deceased bodies from China. I come from Birmingham, where in 2018 an exhibition called Real Bodies by Imagine Exhibitions visited the National Exhibition Centre. It consisted of real corpses and body parts that had gone through a process of plastinization, whereby silicone plastic is injected into the body tissue to create real-life mannequins or plastinated bodies. The exhibit advertised that it uses real human specimens that have been respectfully preserved to explore the complex inner workings of the human form in a refreshing and thought-provoking style. Dig deeper, however, and it becomes clear that those deceased human bodies and body parts are unclaimed bodies with no identity documents or consent. Sourced from Dalian Hoffen Biotech in Dalian, China, notably Dalian Labour Camp from 1999 to 2013 was notoriously known for its severe torturing of Falun Gong practitioners. The commercial exploitation of body parts in all its forms is surely unethical and unsavoury. When it's combined with mass killing by an authoritarian state, we cannot stand by and do nothing. In 2019, the China Tribunal, led by Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, stated this: the tribunal's members are certain, unanimously, and sure beyond reasonable doubt, that in China forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience has been practiced for a substantial period of time, involving a very substantial number of victims. Falun Gong practitioners have been one, and probably the main source of organ supply. And in regard to the Uyghurs, the tribunal had evidence of medical testing on a scale that could allow them, amongst other uses, to become an organ bank. China has always denied the claims, brushing them off as rumours, and the WHO has continuously backed this up. The UK Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office has stated that the WHO shares its view that China was implementing an ethical voluntary organ transplant system in accordance with international standards, although its concerns about overall transparency. How it was revealed by the UK government in 2019 that the WHO's assessment is based on China's own self-assessment. The WHO has not carried out its own assessment of China's organ transplant system. It does not have an independent expert compliance assessment mechanism in place to carry it out. Over the years, evidence of forced organ harvesting has continued to build, and whistleblowers have stepped forward. The body of evidence is becoming vast, including detailed statistical analysis of transplantations and donations, numerous recorded undercover telephone conversations, legal and policy statements, and the practice of the government and the party advertisements, admissions of university and military personnel, and a large number of very brave personal testimonies. Most recently, further evidence was heard during the course of the Uyghur Tribunal, including Saragul Salpe, who testified during the June hearings that she discovered medical files detailing Uyghur detainees, blood types, and results of liver tests while she was working at a Uyghur camp. Ethan Gutman, Senior Research Fellow, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, spoke about his recent reports on the forced organ harvesting from Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang, including his witness interviews, the human organ fast lanes in the Umki and Kashgar airports, and the construction of vast crematoriums throughout the region. In June this year, 12 UN special procedure experts raised the issue of forced organ harvesting with the Chinese government in response to credible information that Falun Gong practitioners, the Uyghurs, Tibetans, Muslims and Christians, are being killed for their organs in China. I've always believed that the UK government could be a powerful advocate for changing these practices, but also that we should put our own house in order and deal with current gaps in our own human tissue legislation. Currently, human tissue legislation covers organ transplantation within the UK, but does not cover British citizens travelling abroad for transplants. And British taxpayers' money will pay for anti-rejection medication regardless of where the organ was sourced or whether it was forcibly harvested from prisoners of conscience. According to NHS Blood and Transplant, between 2010 and July 2020, there were 29 cases on the UK transplant registry of patients being followed up in the UK after receiving a transplant in China. Now, our Human Tissue Act of 2004 has strict consent and documentation requirements for human tissue sourced within the UK, but it does not restrict imported human tissue in this way. It merely is advisory. And so my bill aims to amend the Human Tissue Act in 5 ways. First, it will prohibit a UK citizen from travelling outside the UK and receiving any controlled material for the purpose of organ transplantation when the organ donor or the organ donor's next of kin had not provided free, informed and special consent. Second, it will prohibit a UK citizen from travelling outside the UK and receiving any controlled material for the purpose of organ transplantation when a living donor or third party receives a financial gain or comparable advantage, or if from a deceased donor a third party receives financial gain or comparable advantage. Third, it will provide for the offences in Section 32 of the Human Tissue Act 2004 to be prohibited even if the offence did not take place in the UK, if the person had a close connection to that country. Fourthly, it will provide for regulations for patient identifiable records and an annual report on instances of UK citizens receiving transplant procedures outside the UK by NHS Blood and Transplant. Lastly, it will provide for imported bodies on display to have the same consent requirements as those sourced from the UK. Article 4 of the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting says this: all governments should combat and prevent forced organ harvesting by providing for the criminalisation of certain acts and facilitate the criminal prosecution of forced organ harvesting both at the national and international level. I think we must take action, and in my country, in the UK, in order to do all we can to prevent these most abhorrent of practices. My bill, I hope, will take us a little way forward, and I'm so pleased to be able to explain this to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Hunt, for your inspiring act, and we hope that your bill will soon be adopted. Dr. Abraham Matai from India is an acclaimed social reformer, a philanthropist by heart, and the founder of the Harmony Foundation in India. He encourages social reformers and organizations across the world to ensure that every human being, every common person gets a fair platform, support, recourse, and resolution to their problem. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Matai.
At the outset, I would like to thank DAFOH, the Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, and its dynamic executive director, Dr. Torsten Trey, for affording me this opportunity to present before this forum. International Human Rights Day is celebrated every year on December 10th, and it is fitting for us to commemorate this day in asserting the equal dignity and rights of each human being in this world, and to take stock of where we are as a global people, accountable to each other in brotherhood as my brother's keeper. Lest we forget, this day as International Human Rights Day is observed every year as the day of the United Nations General Assembly on the 10th day of December in 1949 adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The grim atrocities of World War II made human rights a priority. This year, 2021, is the 73rd anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Many governmental and non-governmental organizations active in the human rights field scheduled special events to commemorate this day. It is thus befitting for DAFOH to facilitate this global symposium towards a just cause in the urgent awareness of its primary objective as enshrined in its name. Lest we forget, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. All states have reached a common understanding, having pledged themselves to achieve the promotion of universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms, which is of the greatest importance for the full realization of this pledge. Although the Declaration of 1948, with its broad range of political, civil, economic, social, and cultural rights, is not a binding document, it inspired more than 60 human rights instruments which together constitute an international standard of human rights. As the founder-president of Harmony Foundation, which was set up in 2005 to establish communal and social harmony between various communities, classes, and castes, and to strive towards the essential dignity and human rights of all and without discrimination of religion, caste, creed, region, or gender, I am honored to be given this opportunity to speak at this important forum. Our work at the Harmony Foundation is up front and center in fighting for the rights and essential dignity of the least amongst us, drawing inspiration from the life and legacy of our patron Mother Teresa, which we strive to keep alive in word, deed, and in recognition. In her recognition, we also host the annual Mother Teresa Memorial Awards as a celebration of exceptional global work in the area of social justice. And while we engage activism in word and in deed, we hold to account the primary developing nations amongst us, including China, which hosts the largest population in the world and also with a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. We believe that the more prominent amongst us must be held to greater scrutiny on human rights. It is therefore contingent upon China not only to act, but also to be seen to act responsibly while we address the issue of forced organ harvesting. Only recently, the Harmony Foundation called out China in strong terms for its dalliance with the Taliban, urging that the international community wake up from its convenient slumber and confront China regarding its blatant display of hypocrisy on the Taliban and its stated cause of being anti-anarchist, yet brutally terrorizing the Uyghur and Hui Muslim minority communities closer home for their religious practices. We also highlighted the reports that over 1 million Uyghur Muslims from Xinjiang province have disappeared into the oblivion of internment camps established by the Chinese government, and together with Falun Gong practitioners are also suspected to be victims of alleged state-sponsored organized organ trafficking, according to media reports. The UN Committee Against Torture and the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture have expressed concern over the allegations of organ harvesting from prisoners and have called on the government of the People's Republic of China to increase the accountability and transparency of its organ transplant system and punish those responsible for abuses. The government of the People's Republic of China has failed to account adequately for the sources of organs when information has been requested by Manfred Nowak, the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. This allegedly and disturbingly makes China the only country in the world that systematically uses organs from prisoners for transplantation. Organ harvesting for trafficking from condemned prisoners violates all principles of medical ethics, besides propagating large-scale abuse and severe human rights violations. The stories emanating about this diabolic enterprise are grim and often impossible to confirm. The work of organizations such as DAFOH is therefore commendable in exposing this malaise, even at the risk of personal safety. For the most part, though, organ trafficking occurs in hospitals where there are corrupt medical practitioners. International organ trafficking is a big business. The World Health Organization defines organ trafficking as commercial transplantation, where there is profit or transplantations occurring outside of national medical systems. Most cases involve the poor, the destitute, and the vulnerable that are willing to part with an organ for money. Transplant tourism flourishes in places with weak authorities where the destitute and economically weak become a store for organs for the wealthy and powerful. Despite the gradual development of a voluntary organ donation system, information continues to emerge regarding serious human rights violations in procurement of organs for transplant, thus creating demand for trafficking in persons for the purpose of organs. Persons trafficked for an organ removal is largely via deception, fraud, and a play of power on destitute conditions. Consequences are long-lasting, and their health is jeopardized permanently. This is an inhuman violation on so many levels. It should gross us out to action, and urgently so. Illegal trade in human organs no doubt involves exploitation of the poor and is a gross violation of their fundamental human rights. The clause relating to compassionate donation in Organ Transplantation Act has been frequently exploited in an unethical manner which is violative of human rights. Given that all states are yet to fulfill their obligation to recognize trafficking in persons for the removal of organs, which is also known as TPRO, as a human rights abuse, most of the victims are neither identified or recognized as trafficked persons, nor granted assistance, remedies, or access to justice. Organ trafficking can be referred to as one of the most cruel and grimmest crimes in the world. As such, it demands a human rights-based approach in analysis and response to this problem by placing the victim at the center of initiatives to combat this vice. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights should also be amended and adjusted to effectively address this grave concern of organ harvesting and trafficking, which is allegedly occurring in China on a very large scale. Measures should also be put in place to effectively combat this vice, to stop and prevent it by heavily penalizing its practitioners to deter its continuation. Activists abhorring organ harvesting and trafficking should rally behind renowned groups and organizations like DAFOH, who are spearheading the campaign to lend gravitas to their cause of outlawing the trade. December 10th, as International Human Rights Day, should be the platform for mobilizing support to stop forced organ harvesting and trafficking, constituting as it does a gross violation of human rights and continuation of slavery, which was outlawed in the 19th century. An aggressive campaign should also be launched for China to be placed under sanctions and even ostracized from the international community till it outlaws and bans organ harvesting and trafficking within its borders and amongst its trading partners. The open support given by the Chinese to the recent Taliban invasion of Afghanistan proves beyond doubt that China could go to any extent to gratify themselves, even to the extent of openly displaying their hypocrisy. How else would you justify when China on one hand arrests Muslims for growing their beards in China, while on the other hand it expresses falling in love with Taliban's beards? More specifically, Falun Gong practitioners have been targeted in this heinous atrocity of organ trafficking to the blind eyes of the world for over 2 decades. How can our world live with tolerating this organized atrocity and still state to uphold the rights and dignity of all humans as right living and conscionable citizens of the world and as the United Nations? I thus close by unequivocally urging the adoption of the new Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting initiated by DAFOH in order to fill the gaps that the 1948 document of the Universal Declaration was not able to fill, in stopping forced organ harvesting in large scale from living people, with a specific call to accountability on China. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Matei, for your strong engagement for human rights causes and for leaving no stone unturned to support righteous individuals and organizations. Your energy to engage all democracies, institutions, and NGOs in the world to counter human rights violations is inspiring. Mr. Erping Zhang, a Falun Gong practitioner, has strongly contributed to revealing human rights abuses against Falun Gong in China and abroad, and will explain how Falun Gong practitioners throughout the world have set up an international movement to warn humanity of the dangers of the Chinese Communist Party. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Erping Zhang.
Thank you for inviting me to this conference. 2 years ago, the world was shocked by drone footage showing blindfolded Uyghur detainees confined in a labor camp in Xinjiang. It has awakened the world to the true nature of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, its disregard for basic human dignity and the threat it poses to the rest of the world. Tragically, this form of suppression and more has been used against practitioners of Falun Gong all across China. Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa, is a traditional spiritual practice of the Buddha school. It consists of 5 sets of gentle meditation exercise and a moral philosophy centered on the tenets of truth, compassion, and tolerance. After its introduction to the public in 1992, government officials actually praised Falun Gong for saving a great amount of Medicare costs for the government, owing to its health benefits and for stabilizing a Chinese society seeing increasing social disparity through its moral-centered teachings. However, then CCP leader Jiang Zemin feared the practice would become an ideological competition to the party on account of its popularity, independence, and traditional spiritual content. In July 1999, the CCP launched a persecution campaign in order to eradicate Falun Gong, which continues to this day. With 70 to 100 million practitioners in 1999, Falun Gong is the largest group that CCP has been trying to eliminate. Even today, after 2 decades of brutal persecution, Freedom House estimates between 7 to 20 million people in China still practice Falun Gong underground. Our own estimates is between 20 to 40 million people. Eliminating Falun Gong has been a top priority for the CCP for more than 2 decades. The methods the party state employs to force Falun Gong practitioners are beyond horrifying. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture estimated in 2006 that 66% of reported torture cases in Chinese detention facilities involved Falun Gong practitioners. The confirmed death toll due to torture and abuses in custody is over 4,700 now, though the actual number is believed to be many times higher. What's more horrifying is the state-sanctioned practice of forced organ harvesting from Falun Gong practitioners. In response to the persecution, Falun Gong practitioners launched the largest peaceful resistance movement in modern Chinese history. From the basements and back rooms of homes across China, Falun Gong practitioners produce and distribute pamphlets and DVDs to expose the CCP lies and crimes. They also distribute free copies of internet freedom software that have helped millions in China to bypass the Great Firewall, to see beyond the plans of authoritarian censorship. This effort has made a profound impact on Chinese society and encouraged over 300 million Chinese people to withdraw from the CCP or its affiliated organizations. the implication of CCP's human rights abuses extended beyond the borders of China. Other than the commonly known issues of slave labor, the ethics of organ transplantation should concern the free world. Many recipients of organs forcibly harvested from Falun Gong practitioners are actually not from China. And with countries subsidizing their healthcare fees for post-transplant recovery, they might be unknowingly acting as accomplices to the CCP's crime against humanity. In other words, China's human rights abuses and the international community's inaction have material consequences to the West, morally and socially. The free world ought to pay attention to and act on human rights situation in China, as helping these persecuted people will ultimately benefit the world in the end. We recommend Western governments make a conscious effort to separate the Chinese Communist Party from the Chinese people in public statements, as they often represent opposite interests. In this way, when Western countries criticize CCP's human rights records, the CCP cannot hide behind the Chinese people and accuse critics of being anti-China or offending the Chinese people. We also recommend that the EU and the US provide additional funding support to software tools circumventing China's internet blockade. This will help encourage information freedom and allow Chinese people to see beyond the Great Firewall. In every historical era, there is a defining moment that calls for the basic human conscience and dignity to make this world a better place. Former U.S. Ambassador to Hungary and co-founder of National Endowment for Democracy, Mark Palmer, said, Falun Gong is, in my judgment, the greatest single spiritual movement in Asia today. There is nothing that begins to compare with it in courage and importance. Despite the plight of Falun Gong practitioners in China, as Aristotle said, it is during our darkest moment that we must focus to see the light. With history on our side, and with support from so many kind-hearted people like the ones on this panel, we are very hopeful that the day will soon arrive when the biggest communist tyranny ends. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zhang, for elaborating on the situation of Falun Gong. After more than 22 years of persecution, we have to acknowledge that the international community has failed to adequately address this violation of basic human rights and free spiritual practice. As humankind, we have to ask ourselves, if forced organ harvesting from living Falun Gong practitioners in China does not move us, what else is needed to move us and to call for a complete end of persecution of Falun Gong and other prisoners of conscience in China? Madam Lucica Haminiu is the president of the Romanian Independent Society of Human Rights. She survived the severe communist rule in Romania and has since closely worked with the United Nations to help refugees and victims of torture in Romania. Madam Haminiu will present her unique insight into international institutions faced with forced organ harvesting in repressive China. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Lucica Haminiu.
Ziua Drepturilor Omului din 10 decembrie 2021 marchează cea de-a 73-a aniversare a adoptării Declarației Universale a Drepturilor Omului de către Adunarea Generală ONU. Pentru a răspunde provocărilor globale ale inegalităților fără precedent în urma pandemiei COVID-19, secretarul general al ONU a declarat că este necesar un nou contract social pentru o nouă eră. În acest context, în 2021, tema campaniilor se concentrează pe egalitate, reducerea inegalităților, promovarea drepturilor omului și articolul 1 din declarație. Toate ființele se nasc libere și egale în demnitate și drepturi. Declarația a fost adoptată în 1948 și a fost rezultatul experiențelor negative ale celui de-al doilea război mondial. Imediat după încheierea acelui război și crearea ONU, comunitatea internațională a simțit nevoia unei protecții eficiente împotriva posibilității repetării unor astfel de atrocități, iar liderii mondiali de la acea vreme au decis să elaboreze un document care să garanteze drepturile fiecărei ființe umane oriunde s-ar afla. Problema de fond a declarației a fost lipsa unui mecanism clar de punere în aplicare. Din acest motiv, Comisia pentru Drepturile Omului a luat în considerare pregătirea unei carte internaționale a drepturilor, completând declarația cu două instrumente obligatorii din punct de vedere juridic: Convenția Internațională cu privire la drepturile civile și politice și Convenția Internațională cu privire la drepturile sociale, culturale și economice. Declarația este recunoscută ca parte a dreptului internațional cutumier universal și reprezintă cheia reformelor la toate nivelurile de reprezentare internațională, regională și națională, respectând caracterul universal, inalienabil și indivizibil al întregii game de drepturi ale omului: politice, civile, sociale, economice, culturale. René Cassin, care a reprezentat Franța la finalizarea textului declarației, a comparat declarația cu porticul sau pritvorul de intrare al unui templu grec clasic, o fundație, trepte și 4 coloane surmontate pe un fronton triunghiular în partea superioară. Cassin a considerat articolele 1 și 2 ca fiind blocurile de la temelie, principiile fundamentale ale demnității, egalității, libertății și solidarității. Preambulul, care explică de ce este necesară declarația, sunt treptele. Articolul 327 sunt 4 piloni. Mai întâi drepturile fundamentale ale individului, apoi drepturile civile și politice, urmate de libertățile spirituale, publice și politice. Al 4-lea pilon este consacrat drepturilor sociale și economice și culturale. Articolele 28-30, care se referă la datoria individului față de societate și la interdicția de a privilegia anumite drepturi în detrimentul altora sau în contradicție cu obiectivele ONU, formează frontonul triunghiular al templului grec al lui Cassin. În 1948, cele 30 de articole au fost concepute ca fiind atot cuprinzătoare pentru protecția ființelor umane. Cu toate acestea, istoria recentă a arătat că au existat obstacole în calea protecției depline a drepturilor omului pe fondul unor crize umanitare majore cauzate de politicile destructive ale regimurilor totalitare, de conflictele interetnice, de terorism, de traficul de droguri, de traficul de persoane, de recoltarea forțată și de traficul de organe. Decizia nefastă de după cel de-al doilea război mondial de a transfera țările din Europa Centrală și de Est în custodia URSS a permis dezvoltarea unui regim atroce, bazat pe ideologia marxist-leninistă și îndreptat împotriva tuturor principiilor și normelor incluse în declarație. Am trăit comunismul totalitar în România într-o perioadă a vieții mele în care dezvoltarea individuală a oricărui tânăr era marcată de doctrina partidului unic ca aparat de oprimare a oricăror opinii contrare. Am văzut și am simțit comunismul la el acasă. Îmi permit să vorbesc despre acel subiect pentru că România a avut cel mai dur și cel mai longeviv aparat totalitar, care nu a putut fi răsturnat decât prin revoltă populară sângeroasă și prin sacrificiul celor care și-au pierdut viața. În nicio țară din Europa Centrală și de Est, sistemul totalitar comunist nu a avut o longevitate și o intensitate atât de mare ca în România, unde și-a menținut poziția de dominare absolută asupra societății, economiei și culturii. Între 2000 și 2004 și 2012 și 2015, guvernele românești au reactivat controversata relație bilaterală dintre România și China. În aceste perioade, persecuția practicanților Falun Gong din România s-a intensificat, aceștia fiind intimidați, alungați și îndepărtați din locurile publice în care practicau, anchetați și amendați. De cele mai multe ori, mașina de poliție în care erau duși pentru anchetă se transforma într-o cameră de tortură fizică și psihică. Relansarea relațiilor româno-chineze a însemnat și o selecție riguroasă a jurnaliștilor acreditați în vizitele oficialilor chinezi în România. Am adus în discuție problemele românești, dar nu este vorba numai despre această țară. Într-un moment în care suferința oamenilor aflați sub controlul dictatorilor a atins limite de nedescris, ar trebui să se ia măsuri concrete împotriva statelor care cantonează confortabil comunismul. Cu toate acestea, multe țări au devenit sofisticate în eludarea principiilor etice și de protecția drepturilor omului. Cred că un rol deosebit în eradicarea practicilor criminale ale guvernelor totalitare ar trebui să fie asumat de statele din Europa Centrală și de Est, cărora istoria le-a acordat rolul de martori și supraviețuitori și care ar trebui să-și asume mandatul onorific. Ca parte a ONU, a Consiliului Europei și a Uniunii Europene, țările postcomuniste din Europa Centrală și de Est trebuie să acționeze sub reflexul memoriei colective pentru a iniția acțiuni de constituire în coaliții diplomatice pentru a sancționa practicile totalitare din orice colț al lumii care vor fi aceleași oriunde și oricând. Recuperarea memoriei ne ajută să identificăm responsabilitățile indispensabile funcționării oricărui sistem democratic. Din nefericire, țările postcomuniste din Europa Centrală și de Est au rămas, începând cu 1989, blocate în sindromul tradițional de ignorare a memoriei, când ar fi trebuit să-și condamne fără echivoc proprii torționari. La nivel mondial, peste 100 de milioane de persoane au fost victime ale sistemului comunist, iar numărul acestora este în creștere considerabilă. Partea întunecată a comunismului oferă o perspectivă asupra dezastrului civilizațiilor și a pierderii însăși noțiunii de umanitate. Comunismul a sufocat țările din Europa Centrală și de Est, unde de regulă aparatul politic identifica inamicul, iar serviciile secrete se ocupau de anihilarea acestuia prin detenție, tortură și execuție. Vreau să împărtășesc cu toată lumea că, pretutindeni și în orice moment, comunismul este și va fi întotdeauna o construcție utopică care transformă individul într-o simplă rotiță în imensa mașinărie a partidului unic, iar totalitarismul este un regim care neagă drepturile omului și subordonează individul intereselor sale. Acestea fiind spuse, ne îndreptăm acum atenția spre China. Lipsa unei poziții ferme din partea statelor membre ale ONU și a faptului că regiunea Asia-Pacific nu dispune de un sistem regional de protecție a drepturilor omului, face posibilă privarea de libertate, privarea arbitrară de libertate, tortura și pedepsa cu moartea. Sub acoperirea asumării libertății de autoguvernare, China rămâne o fortăreață în care relația dintre drepturile omului implică un statut social în varianta proprie, criminală, dezvăluită de un număr mic de martori și de foarte puțini supraviețuitori ai persecuțiilor îndreptate constant împotriva practicanților Falun Gong, musulmanilor și creștinilor. Privarea arbitrară de libertate a acestor segmente de populație în centre de detenție și campusuri, spitale fortificate care conțin un amestec de forme culturale, permite torționarilor mobilitatea practicilor de exterminare prin tortură, prelevarea de organe de la ființe vii, uciderea fără proces și fără răspundere. Potrivit unor cercetători, persecuția de peste 2 decenii a Falun Gong, inclusiv prelegarea forțată de organe, îndeplinește criteriile unui așa numit genocid rece. Un genocid care are loc atât de discret și de lent, încât nu este perceput ca atare de comunitatea internațională. Eradicarea organizată de stat a grupului spiritual Falun Gong, prin intermediul securității extrajudiciare Birou 610, este una dintre cele mai grave încălcări ale declarației în secolul 21. China a ocolit cu iscusință sistemul internațional de alertă al comunității internaționale, dar interviurile cu victimele arată că există sute de mii de persoane persecutate în fiecare zi. Astfel, pe parcursul a 20 de ani, s-a format un mecanism de distrugere umană care acum se autoperpetuează. Recent a existat un răspuns oficial din partea organizațiilor internaționale și europene pentru a găsi soluții pentru efectuarea unor inspecții și investigații independente serioase cu privire la persecuția și recoltarea forțată de organe de la practicanții Falun Gong, segmentul de populație care reprezintă cea mai mare sursă de aprovizionare pentru torționare din China. Recoltarea forțată și traficul ilegal de organe ar trebui să fie pe agenda permanentă a organismelor internaționale și regionale și o prioritate pentru fiecare stat în parte pentru a marginaliza și sancționa statul chinez. Ca răspuns la crimele comise de Partidul Comunist Chinez, în ultimii 20 de ani, în 2019 a fost înființat Tribunalul pentru China, un tribunal popular independent cu sediul la Londra. Tribunalul a fost alcătuit de experți internaționali și a fost prezidat de Sir Geoffrey Nice, care a condus anterior urmărirea penală a fostului președinte iugoslav Slobodan Milosevic la Tribunalul Penal Internațional de la Haga. În hotărârea sa preliminară din 2019, Tribunalul pentru China a afirmat că regimul chinez continuă să ucidă prizonieri de conștiință și să le vândă organele pentru profit și de asemenea a declarat China drept stat criminal, acuzând-o că a tolerat și a mușamalizat recoltarea forțată de organe timp de 20 de ani. Tribunalul a concluzionat că practicanții practicii spirituale Falun Gong au fost una dintre principalele surse de organe și a descris recoltarea forțată de organe ca fiind cea mai mare încălcare posibilă a drepturilor omului. Cu doar câteva zile în urmă, la 29 noiembrie, Comisia pentru Drepturile Omului a Parlamentului Uniunii Europene a organizat un panel în cadrul căruia s-au făcut prezentări și s-au tras concluzii cu privire la situația recoltării forțate de organe de la ființe vii condamnate la detenție arbitrară în lagările chinezești. Parlamentarii UE au remarcat că acest fenomen criminal fără precedent ar necesita numirea unui raportor special independent atât la nivelul UE cât și la nivelul ONU. Aceștia au concluzionat afirmând că detenția arbitrară și încarcerarea în lagăre a diferitelor categorii de persoane aparținând minorităților etnice, confesiunilor și religiilor, a opozanților politici ai sistemului totalitar chinez, precum și prelevarea forțată de organe de la ființe umane și vânzarea acestora pe piața neagră reprezintă cea mai gravă încălcare a drepturilor omului în secolul 21. De asemenea, parlamentarii UE s-au angajat că vor urmări acest dosar deja constituit și vor aduce în atenția sesiunilor din martie și iulie 2022 pentru a stabili sancțiuni concrete. În această toamnă, la summitul mondial pentru combaterea și prevenirea recoltării forțate de organe, au participat experți internaționali în domeniul eticii medicale, al justiției, al drepturilor omului, al libertății religioase, precum și martori ai ororilor comuniste din lagările de exterminare din China. În ultima zi a summitului a fost inițiată Declarația Universală privind combaterea și prevenirea recoltării forțate de organe pentru a mobiliza comunitatea internațională să ia măsuri pentru a pune capăt recoltării forțate de organe de la persoanele deținute arbitrar din motive politice și religioase în China. Summitul a fost precedat la 14 iulie 2021 de declarații tulburătoare făcute de experții ONU în domeniul drepturilor omului cu privire la rapoartele privind presupusele prelevări de organe care vizează minoritățile, inclusiv practicanții Falun Gong, uigurii, tibetanii, musulmani și creștinii aflați în detenție în China. Alarmați de acuzațiile de recoltare de organe, experții ONU în domeniul drepturilor omului au solicitat Chinei să răspundă prompt la aceste acuzații și să permită monitorizarea independentă de către mecanismele internaționale privind drepturile omului. De asemenea, aceștia au fost profund îngrijorați de rapoartele privind tratamentul discriminatoriu al prizonierilor sau deținuților pe criterii etnice, religioase sau de credință. Un alt mecanism al ONU pentru drepturile omului a evidențiat preocupările legate de practica recoltării de organe de la prizonierii aparținând unei anumite minorități religioase. În ciuda dezvoltării treptate a unui sistem de donare voluntară de organe, continuă să apară rapoarte privind încălcări grave ale drepturilor omului în ceea ce privește prelevarea de organe pentru transplanturi în China, au declarat experții ONU. China respinge în mod constant recomandările Consiliului ONU pentru drepturile omului în cadrul procedurii de revizuire periodică universală, pentru a respecta dreptul la viață, dreptul de a nu fi supus torturi, accesul liber la justiție, libertatea de opinie, garantarea drepturilor religioase. Declarația universală privind combaterea și prevenirea recoltării forțate de organe este un document foarte important. Mă opresc puțin asupra acestei recente declarații universale. Privită de noi ca un apel la o acțiune colectivă, această declarație marchează un punct de cotitură în ceea ce privește înțelegerea faptului că există o nevoie urgentă de un mecanism internațional independent de monitorizare și raportarea situației drepturilor omului din China. În secolul 21, prelevarea forțată de organe de la persoane în viață nu este în niciun caz doar o problemă națională, ci o problemă a umanității. Declarația care invită toate organizațiile și persoanele fizice din întreaga lume să semneze împreună este un instrument pentru a opri brutalitatea Partidului Comunist Chinez. În calitate de cosemnatar al declarației, Sirdu își exprimă interesul de a declanșa o acțiune hotărâtă din partea factorilor de decizie din întreaga lume pentru a pune capăt și a preveni practicile ilicite care afectează viața și integritatea umană în interesul unor interese personale. O realizare prospectivă a evaluării ar trebui să determine China să procedeze la autodenunțare. Nu trebuie uitat că împotriva tuturor datelor elocvente prezentate timp de 20 de ani, a mărturilor și a dovezilor existente, cel mai bun aliat al dictaturii chineze a fost și continuă să fie tăcerea. Considerăm că în cei 73 de ani de la adoptarea declarației, China și-a pierdut locul în rândul țărilor care luptă pentru protecția drepturilor omului, rămânând captivă opiniilor exprimate de oficialii săi, conform cărora declarația reflectă exclusiv simple idei occidentale. La 10 octombrie 1968, la 20 de ani de la adoptarea Declarației Universale a Drepturilor Omului, cel care a fost numit părintele declarației, René Cassin, a primit Premiul Nobel pentru Pace. La primirea premiului, Cassin a declarat: "Sunt foarte fericit", dar a adăugat: "Aș fi mai fericit dacă ar exista ceva mai multă dreptate în lume." Subscriem la speranța că va exista mai multă dreptate în lume și că multe țări vor pune în aplicare Declarația Universală a Drepturilor Omului, iar acum, având în vedere dovezile de netăgăduit, se vor alătura Declarației Universale privind combaterea și prevenirea recoltării forțate de organe.
Thank you for sharing your personal experiences in former communist Romania. Silence is indeed the enemy of the persecuted. Also, thank you for reminding us about the experience of the Czech and Lithuanian republics. These countries remain examples of how former communist countries can move forward to respect human rights and democracy. We also hope that your talk will be an inspiration to the United Nations and other organizations to end forced organ harvesting through the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting. In this context, please allow me to briefly mention the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting, launched in September at the World Summit on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting. You may learn more about the Universal Declaration on Combating and Preventing Forced Organ Harvesting and today's speeches on the Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting website. Ladies and gentlemen, we can see that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the Convention Against Genocide, has failed to defend and protect Falun Gong practitioners, religious minorities in the face of forced organ harvesting and other forms of persecution. The Chinese government signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on the 20th of July, 1949. The international community accepted that signature in good faith and hoped that China would change for the better. The international community thus left China unchecked. The Chinese Communist Party took advantage of humankind's trusting belief in goodness. Despite signing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, less than 20 years later, it killed millions during the Cultural Revolution and then shocked the world in 1989 with the student massacre of the Tiananmen Square. In what seems a complete mockery of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, exactly 50 years to the date after signing the declaration, then Chinese Communist Party chairman Jiang Zemin launched his persecution of Falun Gong on the 20th of July 1999. On the surface, the Chinese government launched a persecution of 70 million citizens practicing Falun Gong. But what the Chinese Communist Party was really persecuting were the three principles of Falun Gong, which are truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. What words could better summarize the meaning of universal human rights than these three principles? In the end, we must ask if the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of Falun Gong is, at its core, an attack on the idea of human rights and a persecution of goodness in humankind. But goodness remains and endures. We have heard it in the passionate words of our speakers today. I hope their determination is an inspiration to all of you, and I hope that we will all sincerely reflect upon what has been shared today. Thank you.